the version 3 clicker. For a little over a year now, Perun has been making a fantastic device that drops right onto their version 2 hybrid MOSFET. It essentially adds a break and a reset to an AEG trigger, which is so satisfying. Something that AEGs have really not had ever is realism. You've got a trigger that's basically mush. So what Perun did essentially was add a magnet to the trigger so it has a break and a reset on every pull. And it's really neat. It interfaces with their version 2 hybrid MOSFET, and now they make a version 3 option for their version 3 hybrid MOSFET. They sent over a MOSFET and their brand new clicker for me to install on an AEG and check out. So I needed an airsoft gun to install this in, and I picked my E&L AKS-74U. This gun is pretty much bare bones stock except for a new connector and some tuning internally. Parts wise, it is 100% out of the box as it was when I got it. So I think this is a perfect option to install the version 3 clicker in, because this is a really nice airsoft gun, fantastic steel body, really great wood handguard. Adding a nice realistic trigger to it is something it really could use. I'm not going to do a complete install for the version 3 hybrid. To be completely honest, about 80% of the install is soldering the wiring, because it does need to be soldered, unlike the version 2. So I'm going to go through that a little bit quickly and give you the highlights of that, and then I'm going to show you how to install the version 3 clicker. Although I'm installing this in an AK today, it'll fit in most version 3 gearboxes out there. The first step in installing the clicker is, of course, to disassemble your airsoft gun, remove the gearbox from the gun, disassemble the gearbox, and take just about everything out. You're going to completely gut it of the electronics, and you will need to remove the trigger and most of the mechanics as well. As stated previously, the Perun version 3 hybrid MOSFET does require a little bit more install and setup than the version 2. It requires pretty much all the wiring to be soldered. There is a little bit of pre-soldering done here, but I'm probably going to undo this so I can solder in the small skinny red wire that's coming off of the board. It also includes a fair amount of really good quality heat shrink. These small plates, you only need one of them, but you get 3 just in case you need to swap this out between models or you have an accident or an issue of any kind. So these get glued into the selector plate, one of them does. And for how to glue them in and where to glue them in, check out this QR code. It'll bring up the instruction manual on the Perun website. There are lots of examples and diagrams and very specific measurements on there where to install that small little plate. You also get a small playing card with the version 3 hybrid MOSFET. I go over all this in my review that I filmed actually a few years ago now. It's been a little while since I checked out one of these. So there's a lot of good information out there, and you've got a ton of fire modes and options from this MOSFET. The first step in setting up the clicker, of course, is installing the MOSFET. I've simply dropped it in here, fed the wiring through, and installed the screw for the cutoff lever there. The version 3 clicker itself is quite an amazing component, and you have a massive amount of adjustability. Right now I have it set on the tougher trigger pull, so it is a heavier trigger pull, but if you want, you can move this pin forward to this slot and have a lighter trigger pull, which is really quite neat. You do need to adjust the spring here as well for that. You can add extra magnets here to increase how tough the trigger pull is too, and it says in the instruction manual that's more intended for plastic body guns like a G36 or plastic body AKs. Your trigger will sit right about here, and this is an AK trigger, so it kind of sits in this little trough here, and you can adjust this Allen key screw here so it aligns properly with no play or extra travel there. There's also a small grub screw here to adjust the opposite end of travel. So you have a pre-travel and a post-travel adjustment on your trigger, so you can adjust it to be as perfect as you can possibly get it for your trigger pull. Installation of the clicker onto the MOSFET is extremely simple. All the shapes line up very easily, as do the pins. This will literally drop in over your MOSFET, and you can see it fits pretty perfectly. From there, your trigger can sit right there, and you can see every time you pull the trigger, it'll snap that component upward and back when you let off due to the magnet. Once the gearbox is assembled, and I also have not installed the screws, I'm just holding this together, you can see it's a really simple mechanism. There's no squish or mush. Once it breaks, it's instantaneous. It feels fantastic. I've got my selector plate insert installed here. This is a Generation 2 E&L selector plate. There's a long list of selector plate distances and measurements on the very end of the instruction manual for the MOSFET. You want to pay close attention to that. I had to move it 4.5 millimeters down from the end of the thick plastic there. And I did have to remove quite a bit of material for it to fit here. But thankfully the material it's made out of is really soft, so metal file made pretty quick work of that. You notice I've also got the wiring fed through here. You get a lot of slack in the wiring, thankfully. And one of these already has your motor pin soldered and heat shrinked, which is rather nice. So that is a kind of a freebie right there. The other motor pin you do have to solder and set up yourself. And then you've got to set up your connector for your battery as well. So there's a little bit of soldering involved. I'll plug in a Titan 11-1. This is their new AK battery. These are great, very snappy, highly recommend them. This is their 11-1 1200 milliamp hour lithium polymer stick battery for the AK. I'll make sure it's on a valid fire mode here. So full auto and semi. And just so you can hear the clicking a little bit more. And with all that said and done, the Perun version 3 clicker. It's really simple, just adds a little bit of magnetism to the trigger, a little bit of extra realism to your AEG replica. Now, story time. This took a little bit of doing, probably about a week off and on, a couple of hours to get it totally installed. Now, it was 100% on me. It's not the fault of the product at all. It is a really simple drop-in product. Just make sure you read the instructions, and I should have read them better. I thought I had the trigger sensitivity on the hybrid MOSFET set to 4, I believe, and you're supposed to set it to 4 in the instructions. I had it set to 1 by accident. I had circled back around thinking it was set to 5. I pulled it one too many times and just went through the programming and it didn't stick. So I had it set to 1, which is not how the clicker is supposed to work. The instructions say to set it to 4. I set it to 5 just when everything was said and done, and it worked. It was great. Very simple. What ended up happening too was when I was assembling my E&L AK-74 here, the screw for the selector stripped out, which is catastrophic. It screws directly into the gearbox shell. I didn't have a spare E&L on hand, so I had to take an older D-Boys gearbox, I think. It's probably 10, 12 years old. Thankfully, it wasn't too terribly difficult to install. It actually dropped right in very, very nicely, and I was able to continue on from there, but that was just a headache having to replace the gearbox shell during the filming of this review. So that was an interesting process, but the lesson is make sure you read the instructions. I even took apart one of my other AKs, an Arcturus AK-12 that had a Perun MOSFET in there, and dropped it in, and it worked without a problem because I already had it set on trigger sensitivity 5. So I figure, okay, I need to double check this and make sure it's on that. I thought I had several times, and for whatever reason, my brain was telling me it was correct. It was not. So, moral of the story is, read the instructions. There is a fair amount to understand about the clicker, despite the fact that's not a very terribly complicated component, just so you guys understand how it works, how to install it, what settings you need to put on your MOSFET to make it all work. All right, story time over. The Perun version 3 clicker. This is awesome. It adds a little bit of realism to your gun for very little money. You just need a version 3 hybrid MOSFET to drop in there with it, and those are not terribly expensive either. So for under $100 US, you can get a little bit more realism in your AK trigger, and I highly recommend these. If not for the realism, then for the fun factor. It just adds an extra layer of grit and fun to an AEG replica. Thanks you guys for watching, and a big thank you to Perun for sending over the clicker and the version 3 hybrid MOSFET. You guys rock, and I love your products. Thanks all, and I'll see you in the next review.